Gethsemane, the darkest night of Jesus, and the prayer that changed history. They called it the Garden of Gethsemane, the place of the olive press. But the place Jesus chose for his final vigil was no garden. It was a ruin. High on the wind-swept shoulder of the Mount of Olives, far from the manicured groves below, lay the skeletal remains of an ancient pre-Davidic sanctuary. The locals shunned it, a place of crumbling megaliths and gnarled, petrified trees that clawed at the sky like the hands of the dead. They called it Makom ha-Efer, the ashen place, for the chalky grey dust that coated every stone, a permanent shroud from a fire long forgotten by history. This is where he led them. The air, warm and fragrant with Passover lamb and unleavened bread in the city below, grew thin and sharp as they ascended. The cheerful cacophony of Jerusalem faded into a profound, unnerving silence, punctuated only by the scuff of their sandals on loose rock and the low, mournful sigh of the wind snaking through the ruins. The moon, a sliver of polished bone in the inky sky, offered little comfort, its light seeming only to deepen the shadows that clung to the fallen pillars and shattered altars. Jesus walked ahead, a silhouette against the star-dusted heavens. He had been quiet since they left the upper room, a different kind of quiet than his usual contemplative peace. This was a heavy, charged silence, a stillness that preceded a storm. Peter, walking closest to him, felt it like a pressure in his chest. Only an hour ago, his heart had swelled with fierce loyalty, his voice ringing with the promise that he would die for his master. Now, that bravado felt like a fool's boast, a child's shout into a hurricane. The cold of the mountain air was nothing compared to the chill that emanated from the man he followed. James and John, the sons of thunder, flanked Peter. John, the one whom Jesus loved, watched his master's back with an aching heart. He could not name the dread that coiled in his gut, but he saw it in the tension of Jesus's shoulders, in the way his head was bowed not in prayer, but as if under an immense, invisible weight. James, ever the pragmatist, simply gripped the hilt of the short sword hidden in his robes, his eyes scanning the treacherous shadows. He didn't understand the mood, but he understood danger, and this place reeked of it. They reached the perimeter of the ruins. A low, broken wall marked the entrance to what might have once been a courtyard. Here, Jesus stopped. He turned to the 8 disciples who followed behind the inner circle. His voice, when he spoke, was strained, lacking its usual resonance. "Sit here while I go over there and pray." He looked at each of them, at Andrew's questioning face, at Philip's confusion, at Thomas's furrowed brow. There was an ocean of love in his eyes, but also a finality, a farewell that they were not equipped to comprehend. He then beckoned to the 3, "Peter, James, John, come with me." And he led them deeper into the labyrinth of stone, past monolithic blocks that leaned against each other like weary giants. The wind grew stronger here, whistling through the cracks and carrying with it the scent of dust and decay. He stopped near a massive, flat-topped boulder that could have been a sacrificial altar. He turned to them, and in the faint moonlight, they saw his face for the first time in an hour. It was a mask of anguish. The serene authority, the gentle power they knew, was gone. In its place was a raw, human vulnerability that terrified them. "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death," he said, his voice cracking. The words struck them like a physical blow. Peter recoiled. This was not their Jesus. This was not the man who calmed the sea, who faced down the Pharisees with divine wit, who raised the dead with a single command. This was a man on the verge of utter collapse. "Stay here," he pleaded, his gaze locking onto Peter's. "Keep watch with me." The command was simple, the last thing a friend could ask of another. Watch with me. But in his eyes it was more. It was a desperate plea for anchorage in a sea of cosmic terror. Peter could only nod, his throat too tight to speak. Jesus turned and stumbled forward, alone, moving toward the heart of the ruins, toward the darkest, most desolate part of the plateau. He walked about a stone's throw away, a distance that felt like a continent. He sought out the very epicenter of the desolation, a hollow formed by three massive, fallen stones that created a small, claustrophobic enclosure, like an open tomb. The three disciples huddled together behind the altar stone, the wind whipping their robes. They were warriors, fishermen, men of grit and strength. But here, in this place, under the weight of their master's sorrow, a profound and supernatural weariness began to settle upon them. Their eyelids grew heavy, their thoughts sluggish. They tried to pray, to focus, but the air itself seemed thick with a spiritual anesthetic, a lulling darkness that promised oblivion. Peter fought it. He remembered his promise, "I will lay down my life for you," and he couldn't even stay awake. He propped his head on his hand, his gaze fixed on the solitary figure of Jesus, now a faint shape sinking to his knees in the gloom. He saw his master fall forward, his face to the ashen earth. Here, in the heart of desolation, shielded from the eyes of his closest friends, the battle for the soul of the world would begin. The ashen ground was a bed of razors against his skin. The sharp, gritty dust filled his nostrils, the taste of ages of ruin. As Jesus fell, it was not merely a collapse of the body, but a surrender to the gravitational pull of a sorrow, so immense it had its own physical weight. Every muscle fiber screamed in protest, every nerve ending flared as if scorched by a phantom fire. For a moment, he lay there, his forehead pressed into the cold, dead earth, the universe shrinking to this single point of agony. Then, a name was torn from the depths of his being, a whisper that carried the force of a shout. Abba. The word was an anchor in a maelstrom. It was the name he had spoken in the secret places of his heart since before time began, the name of perfect communion, of boundless love, of indivisible unity. Abba, Father. He clung to the word as a drowning man clings to a splinter of wood. Abba, Father. He prayed, his voice a raw, broken thing. Everything is possible for you. He was not stating a theological fact. He was reminding his own fracturing human consciousness of a truth that was rapidly being eclipsed by the encroaching horror. He was the Word through whom all things were made, yet in this moment, his own power felt like a distant memory. He had to reach for the Father's M's. And then he named the terror. Take this cup from me. The cup. It was not an object of gold or silver, but a vessel of pure dread that materialized in the landscape of his soul. It was offered to him not by the Father's hand, but by the cold, inexorable logic of sin and justice. He did not need to see it to know its contents. He could taste it on the back of his tongue, a vintage of pure poison distilled from the whole of human history. He tasted the bitter pride of Cain, the metallic tang of Abel's innocent blood crying out from the ground. He felt the suffocating deluge of a world given over to wickedness, the water not cleansing but only confirming the depth of the stain. The arrogant blasphemies of Babel's builders echoed in his ears, their words a discordant symphony of rebellion. He choked on the sulphurous memory of Sodom's lust and the sterile salt of Lot's wife, a monument to a heart that looked back. The torrent intensified. It was a flood of every lie ever whispered, every secret cruelty, every casual betrayal. He felt the cold ambition of kings who built thrones on the bones of the poor, the avarice of priests who profited from piety, the hollow loneliness of the addict, the silent scream of the abused child. It was a galaxy of human failure, a swirling nebula of pain, and it was all being poured into him. He, who was perfect purity, was being made the repository for all filth. He, who was perfect truth, was being drowned in all lies. And beneath this tidal wave of sin was the physical premonition, sharp and specific. The hiss of the nine-tailed scourge as it bit into flesh, the splintering of wood against his back, the brutal, percussive shock of iron spikes being driven through nerve and bone. The thirst, the suffocation, the slow, agonizing failure of a body nailed to a tree. Yet even that was not the dregs of the cup. The true terror, The absolute poison at the bottom was something else entirely. It was the consequence of bearing all that sin. It was separation. For the first time in all of eternity, he felt the warm, life-giving light of his Father's presence begin to recede. It was not a sudden snuffing out, but a slow, agonizing eclipse. The song of eternal communion that had been the very fabric of his existence was fraying, its harmonies dissolving into a horrifying, dissonant silence. This was the true death. This was hell, to be utterly, completely, and finally forsaken by the one he called Abba. This was the cup he begged to have taken away. Back by the altar stone, Peter's head snapped up. A guttural sound had pierced the lulling wind, a sound of such profound agony that it cut through the supernatural fog that had enveloped him. He blinked, his vision swimming. Through the gloom, he could just make out the form of his master, not kneeling peacefully, but writhing on the ground as if in the grip of a violent seizure. Peter's heart hammered against his ribs. He had to go to him. He had to help. He tried to push himself up, but his limbs were made of lead. The weariness was no longer just a feeling. It was a physical restraint, a thick, invisible blanket pressing him down. It was a spiritual gravity, pulling his soul away from the battle and into the dreamless void of sleep. John moaned softly beside him, lost to it. James was a silent lump, his breathing deep and even. Peter's promise, "I will die for you," mocked him. He couldn't even stay awake for him. His eyelids, heavy as stone gates, slid shut. A hand on his shoulder shook him from the precipice of sleep. Peter jolted upright, disoriented and ashamed. Jesus was standing over them, his form casting a long wavering shadow in the moonlight. His posture was that of a man who had aged a century in an hour. His voice, when he spoke to Peter, was not angry, but filled with a sorrow so deep it was almost an accusation in itself. "Simon," he said, using his old name, the name of the impulsive, unreliable fisherman, "are you asleep? Could you not keep watch for 1 hour?" The question hung in the cold air, unanswered. There was no excuse. Peter looked down. The dust of the ruin, suddenly the most interesting thing in the world. Jesus' gaze swept over the other two sleeping forms. A sigh escaped his lips, a breath of profound loneliness. "Watch and pray so that you will not fall into temptation," he urged them, his voice gaining a sliver of its old authority. He looked back at Peter, his eyes seeing not just the sleeping disciple, but the coming denial, the sifting, the bitter tears. "The spirit is willing," he said, a statement of both grace and solemn fact, "but the flesh is weak." He gave them one last, lingering look of love and disappointment. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back into the heart of the desolation, back to the open tomb of stone. He had come seeking a human anchor, and found only the limp ropes of mortal weakness. The first assault was over, but the taste of the cup was still on his lips, and he knew the battle had barely begun. He sank to his knees once more, the weight of a world's sin pressing him down, utterly and terribly alone. He did not walk back to the hollow of stones. He staggered. The first wave of the assault had left him physically depleted, his body trembling with the aftershocks of a spiritual cataclysm. The cold of the stone floor seeped into his bones not as a physical sensation, but as the very essence of the abandonment he was facing. The wind, no longer a mournful sigh, now shrieked through the ruins like a chorus of accusers, each gust whispering a new temptation into the depths of his human soul. He knelt again, the gritty ash a familiar torment. He closed his eyes, trying to find the sacred inner chamber of communion, the silent sanctuary where he had always met the Father. But the doorway was blocked. The path was overgrown with the thorny vines of every human transgression he now bore. In its place, visions not of the past, but of what could be began to bloom in the darkness of his mind with vivid, seductive clarity. He saw himself, not on a cross, but on a throne. Not the throne of David in Jerusalem, but a throne that oversaw all the kingdoms of the world. It was the same temptation offered in the desert, but this time it was not presented by a slithering, external voice. It rose from the depths of his own, legitimate human desire to see justice and righteousness reign. He saw legions, not of angels, but of men, their faces alight with devotion, their swords raised not to kill him, but to fight for him. He saw the corrupt temple cleansed, not by a whip of cords, but by a righteous fire that consumed the greedy and the hypocritical. He saw the Roman eagle broken and its standards trampled under the feet of a liberated Israel. He saw peace, a pax Christi, established by divine power and unyielding strength. It would be so easy. A single word from him, and the 12 legions of angels he had spoken of would descend not as a metaphor, but as a glittering, terrifying reality. They would shatter the legions of Rome, incinerate the Sanhedrin, and place the crown on his head. There would be no cross, no pain, no forsakenness, only victory, only power, only a world remade in his image, by force. The temptation was insidious because it was wrapped in the guise of goodness. "Isn't this what you came to do?" A part of his own mind reasoned. To establish the kingdom, to bring light. Why choose the path of failure, shame, and agony when the path of glory is right here? Is a broken, dead Messiah truly a victory? He groaned, pressing his palms into his eyes as if to physically block the images. His spirit, the divine essence, eternally one with the Father, knew the answer. But his soul, the seat of his human will, emotions, and intellect, was in a state of civil war. The path of power was a lie. It was Satan's shortcut, a kingdom built on coercion, not love, a righteousness enforced by fear, not won by sacrifice. It would save the world by enslaving it to power, the very thing he came to overthrow. He pushed the vision away and was immediately assailed by another, this one far more personal and heart-wrenching. He saw Mary, his mother. He saw her not as she was now, a woman of strength and quiet faith, but as she would be at the foot of the cross. He saw her face contorted in a grief no mother should ever bear, her soul pierced by a sword as Simeon had prophesied. He saw Mary Magdalene, her fierce love shattered into a million pieces, her wails lost in the jeering of the crowd. He saw John, the beloved, standing helpless, his face a canvas of horror and devastation. He saw Peter, after the rooster's crow, his spirit broken, weeping in an alleyway, drowning in shame. "You will do this to them," the voice of his human heart whispered. "The ones you love most, you will destroy with your suffering. Is your mission worth their agony? You can spare them this. Just walk away, take them with you, disappear into Galilee. Live a quiet life, teach, heal, love them in peace. Let the world find another way." This was the cruelest cut. To bear his own pain was one thing. To be the direct cause of the unbearable suffering of those he cherished was another. His love for them, so pure and powerful, was being turned into a weapon against the Father's will. A shudder racked his body. A cold sweat, thick and oily, broke out on his brow. His breath came in ragged gasps. The spiritual pressure was becoming physically manifest. The capillaries beneath his skin, strained beyond their limits by the extreme stress, began to rupture. The sweat on his forehead and arms mingled with tiny beads of blood, which then coalesced into heavy, crimson drops. They clung to his skin for a moment before falling, dark and viscous, onto the pale, ashen ground. Plip, plip, each drop was a testament to the war raging within. He cried out again, his voice now a hoarse plea. "My Father, if it is not possible for this cup to be taken away unless I drink it." The sentence hung in the air, unfinished. He was wrestling with the divine necessity, the terrible, beautiful logic of the redemption plan. He was acknowledging the impossibility of any other way. Then, with a final, monumental act of will that cost him everything, he finished the prayer. "May your will be done." It was not a passive resignation. It was an active, violent alignment of his human will with the divine will of the Father. It was the choice to embrace the cross, to choose the path of suffering love over the path of coercive power, to accept the agony of his loved ones as part of the price. It was the moment the war turned. He had not yet won, but he had chosen the battlefield on which the victory would be secured. Exhausted, he pushed himself up. His limbs felt disconnected, his body an alien thing. He looked back toward the altar stone. The three forms were still, dark heaps of failure against the pale rock. He needed to go to them, to try one more time to pull them into the reality of the hour. As he stumbled back, the wind seemed to die down, as if holding its breath. The ruins were silent, save for the sound of his own tortured breathing and the soft, damning rhythm of his blood dripping onto the dust. He was choosing to save a world that, in the form of his closest friends, could not even stay awake for him. The loneliness was absolute. He reached the altar stone like a swimmer fighting his way to shore after being battered by a merciless sea. His tunic was damp with bloody sweat, clinging to his skin. The faces of his friends, slack and peaceful in sleep, were a surreal counterpoint to the cosmic violence he had just endured. For a moment, he simply stood over them, a sentinel of sorrow. The faint moonlight silvered their hair and beards, painting them in an undeserved innocence. He reached out and shook Peter's shoulder again, this time with more urgency. "Peter?" Peter started, a guilty grunt escaping his lips. His eyes flew open, wide with confusion, and the immediate, sickening recognition of his failure. James and John stirred beside him, blinking awake into the same cloud of shame. They sat up, rubbing their eyes, the remnants of sleep-drugged comfort evaporating in the cold, judging air. They saw him then, not just the master who had woken them, but the state he was in. His face was pale and drawn, streaked with grime and sweat. His eyes were hollowed out, red-rimmed, and filled with a pain that seemed ancient. His tunic, where it clung to his neck and arms, was dark with moisture. In the ghostly light, they could not discern its true color, but the air around him was thick with the coppery scent of blood. "Why are you sleeping?" His voice was not a rebuke, but a lament. It was the question of a captain to his watchmen who have slept through the approach of the enemy fleet. "Get up and pray, so that you will not fall into temptation." He did not wait for their mumbled apologies. He could see the struggle in their faces, the spirit's willing intention warring against the flesh's overwhelming weakness. He saw their love for him, and he saw its utter inadequacy for the hour at hand. Their failure was not just a personal shortcoming. It was a symptom of the human condition he had come to redeem. They could not watch with him for 1 hour, because the darkness arrayed against him was not merely human. It was principalities and powers, a spiritual force that pressed down on the world, and its first weapon was a deep, soul-crushing weariness. They were not just tired, they were being subdued. He turned from them, the weight of their failure adding to his own burden. He had to go back. The victory of his will was fragile, a hard-won beachhead that had to be defended. The enemy, having failed to break him with the temptations of power and sentiment, would now return with a different, more brutal assault. As he made his way back to the Hollow of Stones for the third time, the very atmosphere of the ruins seemed to change. The silence that followed the shrieking wind was more terrifying. It was a dead, listening silence. The shadows no longer clung to the stones. They seemed to writhe and deepen, coalescing into shapes at the edge of his vision. The air grew thick and suffocating, reeking of the grave. This was the enemy's last, most desperate surge before the physical arrest. This was the assault of pure, unadulterated despair. He fell to his knees, the impact jarring his already tormented body. He did not bother to form the words of the prayer again. His entire being was now a single, sustained utterance of that prayer. "Not my will, but yours." But now, the abyss opened before him. He was shown a vision, not of sin's past or an alternate future, but of redemption's perceived futility. He saw the cross, not as a symbol of victory, but of ultimate defeat. He saw his own body, broken and bleeding, a spectacle of shame. He heard the jeers of the crowd, the sneers of the soldiers, the triumphant laughter of the chief priests. You failed. The vision fast-forwarded. He saw the centuries spool out. He saw his followers, the ones for whom he was doing this, warring against each other in his name. He saw crusades and inquisitions, pogroms and witch hunts, the banner of the cross held aloft over fields of slaughter. He saw his message of love twisted into a cudgel of judgment and exclusion. He saw his name invoked to justify slavery, to bless armies, to accumulate wealth, to build empires of hypocrisy. He saw the billions who would reject him, the countless who would be indifferent, the many who would actively hate the very sound of his name. Look, the despairing darkness whispered, its voice the sound of grinding stone. This is what you are dying for. For this, you will pour out your life, your blood, your very soul. And for what? For a legacy of failure. For a church that will dishonor you. For a world that will not change. Your agony is pointless. Your sacrifice is for nothing. It will be forgotten, or worse, corrupted. The darkness will swallow your light. It always does. This was the final, most potent poison in the cup. Not just the bearing of sin, not just the pain of the cross, not just the forsakenness of the Father, but the soul-crushing despair that it would all be in vain. Every fiber of his human consciousness screamed that it was true. The evidence was overwhelming. The weight of it was unbearable. A cry of ultimate dereliction tore from his throat, a sound that was not human, a raw note of pure agony that vibrated through the very stones of the ruin. He felt his connection to the Father flicker, threatening to extinguish completely under this final onslaught. His heart hammered in his chest, struggling to pump the blood that felt thick as sludge. This was it, the breaking point, the moment the will could shatter and the soul could be lost in the infinite, empty dark. And in that moment of ultimate extremity, when his own strength was utterly gone, something happened. A presence. It was not the all-encompassing warmth of the Father, for that was still eclipsed. This was different. A light, not of the moon or stars, began to glow in the hollow of stones. It was a light that was both gentle and immensely powerful, a silver-white brilliance that pushed back the writhing shadows. Out of the light stepped a figure, radiating a calm and strength that was a direct answer to his agony. It was an angel, one of the celestial host, sent from the throne room of heaven itself. The angel did not speak. Words were useless here. It knelt before him, its form shimmering with divine power. It reached out, not to touch him, but to emanate a wave of pure, spiritual strength. It was not a removal of the cup. The cup remained. But the angel's presence was a direct ministration from the Father, a message sent across the abyss of separation. You are not alone. I see you. I am with you. The angelic presence was a transfusion of heavenly fortitude into his collapsing human frame. It did not lessen the pain, but it bolstered his ability to endure it. It was the Father's answer to the Son's prayer, not to change the plan, but to provide the strength to see it through. The despair, while not vanquished, lost its all-consuming power. The vision of failure faded, replaced by the deep, resonant truth of the Father's sovereign purpose, a purpose that saw beyond the cross, beyond the sin, beyond the failure of man, to the ultimate victory of resurrection. He took a deep, shuddering breath. The war was over. The decision, made in weakness, was now sealed in divine strength. He had faced the absolute worst the darkness could throw at him, and his will, though battered to the point of extinction, had held. Your will be done. The words were no longer a struggle, but a statement of serene, resolute fact. The light of the angel receded, not abruptly, but fading back into the fabric of the night, leaving behind a profound and ringing stillness. The shrieking wind was gone. The oppressive, listening silence was broken. In its place was a quiet peace, the calm that settles over a battlefield after the decisive charge. The ruins of Makom Ha-Efer no longer felt like a place of dread, but simply a place of ancient, sleeping stone. The air was cool and clean. Jesus pushed himself to his feet. He moved not with the vibrant energy of a man refreshed, but with the slow, deliberate grace of a man who has passed through an unspeakable fire and emerged on the other side, forever changed. The trembling in his limbs had ceased. The agony in his features had been replaced by a mask of resolute sorrow and sovereign calm. He was no longer a man on the verge of collapse. He was a king walking toward his coronation, and he knew the path led directly through the executioner's block. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, smearing the mixture of blood, sweat, and ashen dust. The physical cost of the battle was written upon him, a preview of the wounds to come. He turned and walked back toward his disciples for the third and final time. He found them, impossibly, asleep again. This time, he felt no surge of disappointment, no pang of loneliness. He simply looked at them with a love that had passed beyond all expectation and into the realm of pure grace. He saw them not for their failure, but for their frailty. He saw the exhausted fisherman, the brash zealot, the young dreamerman of dust, wholly incapable of comprehending the cosmic struggle that had just taken place a stone's throw away. His battle had secured their future, even as they slept through it. His wakefulness was their only hope. He stood over them as the first hint of dawn began to bruise the eastern sky, a faint line of violet and grey behind the mountains of Moab. The final watch of the night was ending. The hour had come. He spoke, and his voice was no longer strained or pleading. It was calm, measured, and final. "Are you still sleeping and resting?" The question was rhetorical, gentle, almost ironic. "Enough," he said, the single word dismissing their failure and closing the chapter on his vigil. The time for watching and praying was over. The time for action had arrived. The hour has come. "Look, the Son of Man is delivered into the hands of sinners." At these words, Peter, James, and John jolted fully awake. There was no grogginess this time, only the cold shock of reality. The Son of Man, delivered. The abstract prophecies they had heard and misunderstood for 3 years were suddenly crystallizing into a terrifying, immediate present. They scrambled to their feet, their hearts pounding with a new kind of dreadnought, the supernatural dread of the ruins, but the primal fear of imminent physical danger. Jesus' gaze was fixed on the path leading down the mountain. "Rise," he commanded, his voice imbued with the authority they had always known, now tempered by the fire of Gethsemane. "Let us go." He took a step forward, toward the path, toward the city, toward his destiny. Then he paused, his head cocked, as if listening to something they could not yet hear. "Here comes my betrayer." They followed his gaze and saw it. A snake of light was winding its way up the dark mountain path from the Kidron Valley, a procession of torches and lanterns, a river of flickering fire in the pre-dawn gloom. They could hear it now, too, the distant clank of metal, the crunch of many feet on the gravel path, the low murmur of determined voices. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through Peter. He instinctively reached for the hilt of his sword, his mind racing. This is it. This is what he was warning us about. This is where I prove I will not fail him. James and John moved to flank Jesus, their faces grim, their hands also moving toward the weapons hidden in their robes. The other 8 disciples, awakened by the commotion, were stumbling forward from the outer courtyard, their faces a mixture of confusion and alarm. But Jesus showed no fear. He did not retreat further into the ruins or look for an escape. He stood his ground, a solitary, calm figure silhouetted against the coming dawn, waiting. He had wrestled with God, with demons, with the very concept of futility, and had won. This mob of men with their swords and clubs was merely the epilogue. He looked at Peter, whose eyes were wild with a fierce, protective instinct. He saw the love there, but he also saw the misunderstanding. Peter was ready to fight a battle of flesh and blood, a battle that was already lost, a battle that was entirely beside the point. The real war had been fought and won here, in the dust, on his knees. "The Son of Man is delivered," he had said. It was not a passive event happening to him. It was a transaction he was now actively overseeing. He was not a victim being captured. He was a sacrifice being presented. He had secured the Father's will in the garden. Now he would walk out to fulfill it. He watched the approaching lights, not as a cornered fugitive, but as a host preparing to receive an expected guest. The darkest night was over. The day of the cross was about to begin. The procession reached the edge of the ruins, the torchlight casting long, dancing shadows that made the ancient stones seem to lurch and writhe. The mob was a motley assembly, grim-faced temple guards in their polished helmets, their spear tips glinting in the firelight, Levites holding clubs and staves, their faces a mixture of self-righteousness and nervousness, and a handful of Roman auxiliaries, their presence sanctioned by the prefect, their expressions bored and professional. They were a physical manifestation of the powers religious and political that he had come to challenge. They spilled into the courtyard, their numbers filling the desolate space, the harsh light chasing away the last vestiges of the sacred stillness. They paused, uncertain, their eyes trying to adjust to the gloom beyond the reach of their torches. There were 12 men huddled together, Galileans by their dress. Which one was the target? Then, a figure detached himself from the front rank of the guards and walked forward into the space between the mob and the disciples. It was Judas. He was not the cackling villain of a story, but something far more chilling, a man who looked ordinary. He had walked with them, eaten with them, listened to the same teachings. Yet now, he moved with a purpose that set him utterly apart. His face, illuminated by the flickering light, was a pale, sweating mask of resolve. He had made his choice, and this was the final, irrevocable step. Jesus watched him approach, his expression unreadable. There was no anger, no shock, only a deep, penetrating sadness. He saw not just the betrayer, but the brokenness that had led him here, the greed, the disillusionment, the fatal misunderstanding of the kingdom he preached. Judas had given the guards a sign. "The one I kiss is the man. Arrest him." It was a perversion of the most intimate gesture of friendship, turning a symbol of love into a mark of death. He walked directly up to Jesus, his steps unnervingly confident. "Greetings, Rabbi," Judas said, his voice attempting a warmth that sounded hollow and false in the cold night air. He leaned in and kissed Jesus on the cheek. The kiss lingered in the air, an act of obscene treachery that seemed to suck the very breath from the night. For a moment, no one moved. The disciples stared in stunned disbelief. The guards waited for the confirmation. Jesus did not pull away. He received the kiss, and in that moment of contact, he spoke to Judas, his voice low, not for the crowd, but for him alone. "Friend," he said, and the word was not sarcasm, but a final, heart-breaking appeal. "Do what you came for." It was a statement of permission. It was the king handing the keys of the dungeon to his own jailer. The use of the word friend was the final, sharpest turn of the Niphonot for Jesus, but for Judas. It stripped him of his self-justification, leaving him naked with the reality of what he had done. He had sold his friend, the only true friend he ever had. A flicker of horror, the first crack in his composure, appeared in Judas's eyes before he stepped back into the shadows of the guards. The spell was broken. The guards surged forward, hands outstretched to seize Jesus. That's when Peter erupted. With a roar of fury and frustrated loyalty, he drew his sword. The blade, a fisherman's utility tool more than a soldier's weapon, flashed in the torchlight. He was not aiming to kill, only to fight, to do something. He lunged not at a soldier, but at the man nearest to him, a servant of the high priest named Malchus. Peter swung wildly, a clumsy, powerful arc meant to drive the man back. Malchus ducked, but not fast enough. The blade sliced past his head and sheared off his right ear. The man screamed, stumbling back, clutching the side of his head as blood poured through his fingers. The advance stopped. The guards raised their weapons. The disciples braced for a slaughter. "No more of this." Jesus' voice cut through the chaos with absolute authority. He turned to Peter, his eyes blazing not with anger, but with a fierce, corrective light. "Put your sword back in its place," he commanded, "for all who draw the sword will die by the sword." He looked at Peter's heaving chest, at the useless weapon in his hand, at his complete failure to understand. "Do you think I cannot call on my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels?" The question hung in the air, a stunning reminder of the power he had willingly set aside in the garden. He could have ended this not with a sword, but with a word. He was choosing this path. But how then would the scriptures be fulfilled that say it must happen in this way? He turned from Peter's bewildered face to the terrified servant. He stepped forward into the circle of armed men and knelt beside Malchus. The guards tensed, unsure what to do. Jesus reached out a hand, his fingers smeared with his own blood and sweat, and gently touched the wounded side of the servant's head. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Where there had been a bleeding wound, there was now whole skin. The ear was restored. Malchus stared, his hand coming away from his head sticky with blood, but his ear was miraculously, inexplicably, there. He looked at Jesus, his eyes wide with a terror that was no longer of the sword, but of the divine. Jesus stood up and faced the captains of the guard and the elders who had come with them. The final trace of the victim was gone, replaced by the full authority of the judge. "Am I leading a rebellion?" he asked, his voice resonating through the ruins, "that you have come out with swords and clubs to capture me? Every day I sat in the temple courts teaching, and you did not arrest me." He let the indictment sink in. He exposed their cowardice, their preference for the shadows over the light. "But this is your hour," he said, his gaze sweeping over all of them, the soldiers, the priests, the frightened disciples, the broken betrayer, when darkness reigns. He was not admitting defeat. He was defining the nature of the moment. He was acknowledging their temporary dominion, the fleeting victory of the night. But his words held a deeper promise, that an hour, by its nature, must end. The reign of darkness was on a clock, and with that, he extended his hands, palms up, in a gesture of complete surrender that was, in reality, an act of absolute command. The guards, their momentary awe forgotten, surged forward and seized him, binding his hands. At the sight of their master being bound, the last of the disciples' courage shattered. This was not the victory they had hoped for. This was the end. One by one they turned and fled, melting back into the shadows of the ruin from which they had just emerged, abandoning him to his fate. John cast one last, agonized look over his shoulder before disappearing into the gloom. Jesus stood alone in the center of the ring of torches, bound, forsaken by his friends, betrayed by a kiss. The mob began to lead him down the mountain, a captive king on his way to a rigged trial and a predetermined execution. He glanced back one last time at the ashen place. The garden of his agony had now become the site of his victory. The prayer for the Father's will to be done was now being answered in the binding of his hands. The darkest night was over, and he was walking willingly into the dawn of a day that would tear the world apart, only to remake it anew.